button is pushed. So this is Drupal Docker DDEV, and not as beyond as I was hoping to go. Full disclosure, I hadn't updated DDEV for a while locally, and the old version did some things I was going to show off that were really cool, but they changed direction a little bit, and it doesn't do quite what I used to want. So we'll still extend it a bit at the end, but it won't go quite as far as I was hoping. So what I'll start out doing is scaring you with how to do all of these things the hard way, and we'll end up with the parts you need to remember about how to run projects locally using DDEV and how to add things to that as well. So really quick, I'm Tyler. I'm a systems engineer with Amaze.io. We are a container hosting platform. We specialize in Drupal, but we host Drupal, WordPress, Django, Node.js of many varieties. We take it all, basically. And I can't say anything in front of people without showing off my absolutely adorable daughter. She's at home with the grandparents right now. So really quick, Docker. If you don't know, Docker is a container system. So container systems have been around for a while. It's just a way of running small bits of a program instead of a whole computer. You get to utilize underlying layers of your computer. So you use the kernel, all these other layers that it builds on top of. So you only have to worry about this one small part. Containers, they run by themselves basically, but we can stitch them together in various ways. So you have a lot of isolation that helps with things like security or running what might be conflicting versions of things at the same time. You can get rid of some fighting. You'll see it called microservices in a lot of places. Those are just single programs running in a container doing a very specialized thing. And then my favorite thing about them is these are cattle. They are not pets. You can destroy them, you can throw them out, and you can get a whole new fleet when you need it. So why do we use Docker containers instead of virtual machines or Vagrant environments or using Ansible to set things up? It's very flexible. If it's not something you want to build, you can probably find someone who's built something you want to use already without having to do a bunch of changes on your own or learning all these new systems. They're usually fast. Goes back to running in isolation or being a microservice, that if it's one very specific thing running by itself as it should, you can get more speed instead of having to run all these supporting services. I mentioned before, you can run a lot of different things at the same time. So if you're developing locally on your laptop, you're running Apache, you're running a version of PHP, port 80 is tied up by all of that. You can't run a project in PHP 5.6 and 7.1 at the same time without a lot of frustration and anger. So when we run things in containers, we get that flexibility and those abilities. And because we're leveraging a lot of the things that your own computer or the system that's running on provides, you utilize for your resources. When you spin up a virtual machine on your laptop, you start up Vagrant or VirtualBox, and you start this virtual machine that has its own whole operating system of its own. It has, it's using all kinds of RAM, lots of disk usage. When we do containers, we get rid of all those layers, and you can run a lot more things with the same resources that you've already been using. So, you're never supposed to do live demos. This is all going to be somewhat live. So, we're going to start really quick and easy. The fastest way to run a Drupal site is the simplest. On Docker Hub, there's a Drupal project, and right there we can start it up. We're doing some things here that you don't have to remember these. What I'm doing here, I'm telling it run on port 80, so we don't have to remember a port number. But if we go to localhost, we can that we will start up. It's a brand new fresh Drupal install, 8.5.3, there it is, it's running. Well, that's entirely someone else's work. All of that is just code wrapped up in this Docker image that you don't have much say over. if you go and read their documentation, they tell you some really complex ways to bring in your own modules, add your theme, all these things. But it's one container, one Docker running that is kind of the wrong way. It's not split up. It's not lightweight. When I downloaded this image, it took a few minutes to pull it down to my computer. Inside of there is running PHP, Apache. There's a database running, not breaking things apart like we should, and doing things the wrong way, kind of. So we can split them apart. Let's run Nginx, PHP FPM, and MariaDB. This is the part you're going to hate. So we'll kill this one. All of these commands, this is why we like tools like DDEV. So first, we'll start a database, and it'll give us some output. Then, let's start our FPM process, get PHP going here, and it's running in the background. And then let's start up our Drupal site. And to run this, I actually had to go and read their documentation and make a custom configuration file and then connect it and put all these pieces together. Oh, and it broke. Well, that basically illustrates the points, because it was actually going to be broken anyways, because I'm using a PHP that doesn't have MySQL in it already. We have to go and add those things. It's not easy to do that. So there's a simpler way to take some of these things. It's called Docker Compose. Docker Compose gives us glue. We can start putting some of these pieces together into an easier to run system.
Good question.
Yes?
So were you actually installing with all those commands, or were you just executing?
I'm just executing with those commands. So the way that a Docker container runs is you have an image, which is think of it like it's kind of like a Git repo. Inside of that is a known state of things. It will have instructions that can execute things, or it can just contain a lot of data. So other folks are creating these images and saving them publicly. I'm not going to get into building Docker images, because that's a 3-week course on its own kind of thing, because it can get really deep really fast. But I'm using public images that are published on Docker Hub, which is just a resource for downloading things like this. At the end, I'll show, one of the things I'll do is I'll actually pull images from the Amazy.io side, things that aren't actually a part of DDEV, and we'll integrate those together. But this is all based on others' work. Let's kill, no. Stop those. Okay, so we'll update my repo. Okay, so Docker Compose gives us the Docker Compose file. So in this one file, I have now told it I need to run that same Nginx server, and so it's going to run on port 80. I'm bringing in a configuration file that tells it where my site is going to live. I'm mounting my code as the app, etc. Same thing on the PHP container, setting up. And I had to do research. I had to go and read their documentation and find the right environment variable names and all these things to stitch these together. But Docker Compose then use my shortcuts, lets me have that one file along with my code, and I can run it, and it starts all those services up for me automatically. But same problem I had before is that there's still some things missing. One big thing missing with both of these methods is, well, how do you call a site by name? Well, I have to go and I have to manage a host file, which if you're working locally, you probably have done a time or two, put in a custom name to work with multiple domains, things like that. So we'll bring up Drupal.local, and it will pull it in. Oh, an error. I'm still missing that MySQL module for my PHP image. Well, I don't want to bother with all those things. It's a lot of work to build all this. So we started up the multiple containers and the single command. with some of these tools, there's just a lot to keep in mind. And that's where we have tools like DDEV. DDEV, Doxel, Landl, Pigby, I'm sure there's another one I'm missing, but all of these tools, or most of them, take and automate all these things for you is the idea, to make it as easy as possible to run them. So most of them use Docker Compose behind the scenes, so it's building on top of another project. Like we're using Symfony, we're leveraging other people's work to make our lives easier as we run things. It helps us manage DNS. DDEV does this by putting in host file entries for you and removing them automatically, so you don't have to think about it. The worst you have to do is type in your admin password to let it have the permission to manage that file. It also sets up a routing layer for us, so we can have custom names for each of our projects that are running at the same time. And when we run DDEV, we'll see how we can set that, give them all unique host names. DDEV, when you run it, it attempts to find out what type of project you're using. So it supports WordPress, a few versions of Drupal, Typo 3, something else in there, but it gives us the ability to run a lot of different types of projects with the same tool. In those projects, they've taught it also how to take care of the settings files. So if your site doesn't have quite the right database connection set up or things like that, it's going to test and see if it can connect, and it'll help you take care of that. So DDEV for Drupal sets up a settings.local.php, which is by default ignored from your Git, so you have that locally, but you're not going to send it out somewhere with those connection details, and take care of all those sorts of things for you. Then it has some cool little extras, like there's a built-in command that fires up SQL Pro and connects you to the database of your project automatically in one command. You don't have to dig through files or find a password and a username and a port and do all that. One little command. Exec lets you run commands against your project. We'll show that in a bit. And then they call it SSH, but it's not SSH like we normally think of it, where we're connecting to a root system. We're kind of just hopping into your project, so you can run Drush, you can run Composer if you need to, things like that on the fly. So the very start of it is using DDEV config. So update my repo. Sometimes permission problems. Let's get rid of that guy. So DDEV config. So this is where it's asking you to name it. It's picking it up from previous configuration, but you can type in whatever you want here to reference this at. This will be turned into later the URL that you're going to use in your browser to access your project. If you're working with a custom web root, some people put your PHP executables in web, some in Docker root, some just have them in the repo root. You can change all of that here, and it takes care of the behind the scenes. Oh, there we go. There's the list of different projects that it supports. So Drupal 6, 7, 8, WordPress, Typo 3 backdrop, straight PHP as well, if you have something custom. That's it. That's all it took to add DDEV to my project. So if I run DDEV start, it goes through. Now this is talking to Docker Compose behind the scenes. And something is holding on to port 80. Nginx. Now it'll start, maybe. There we go. Takes a little longer. Okay, so it started up and it told us all of the different ways we can access the site. So we can get in there, we can load the site, and it's a blank Drupal site, so it's going to ask us to install it. So it gives us a command, so we can do that easily. So DDEV import DB. So I have an export of the database from before, but there's a flag, and that will take that database dump and bring it in. So now if go back to our site, we should just have a plain blank Drupal site. Yeah.
How does it authenticate against the database password?
So that's the local settings file. So DDEV saw that I didn't have a way to talk to the database. So it actually created for me their own settings file. So it put in their database credentials they're pretty predictable, DB, 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 DB. But it took care of setting up that file. It's doing some PHP configuration there, things like that, just from the DDEV config command.
Okay.
Also, anytime you run DDEV start, it checks for this as well to make sure that if you are starting from a fresh checkout of your project, new computer, coworker pulling something down, it'll check for this as well, create it if it needs it, but it takes care of all those connections for you. So you don't have to think about it.
Well, I'm always concerned about password and usernames.
Sure.
Storing in repos, and we're having to figure out export import processes for MySQL.
Right.
So there's some risk associated with this type of. So that's why I was curious on.
Sure. Yeah. And then this file, you can see my editor has it grayed out that it's in the git ignore. So even though they're very predictable, simple credentials, they're never going to make their way back out. Another way you can handle that is some of the tools use environment variables.
Okay.
So those are set inside of that database system that's running, and then it just pulls them in on the fly. So all you ever have in your code is get env db password, and that's it. Some stuff like that. So each of the tools also handles those in different ways. So
in this case, you had a functioning Drupal site, well, not a functioning, but you had your code, and you just installed DDEV.
Correct.
And so he ignored your settings PHP and made a settings local.
Right, yeah, it saw that there was a settings.php, so it's not going to overwrite that because I have my own things in there. Then it checks, in their docs, it tells you how it does the logic on that, but it comes down to it's going to leave your files, if they exist, alone, and then add settings.local is kind of the last option it has to bring this in. If you don't have a settings file at all, which sometimes to keep credentials from being passed around, you won't commit the settings file into your repo, it will actually create one right there as part of that start command. This is Darren.
Hi, Darren.
Where'd my presentation go? Okay, so we can import the DB, and that's then just running. DDEV exec and SSH are simply ways to run commands either against the site using Drush or doing things like Composer, Gulp, tools that are built inside of there. So if we wanted to log into this site as the admin user, we can issue, DDEV exec drush ULI. Give me a login for the admin user. And because we've set a project name and it knows what those URLs are, what it will spit back to us is actually a full clickable link, depending on your terminal, but then we're just inside the site. We don't have to remember passwords, move things around. We can just jump in, generates those URLs for us. Really handy. Yes?
How is Drush configured in this? Is it part of the image, or is it like a site local dependency that you install in Composer?
So I know it's in my Composer file. I don't know which one it's using, but it will. There is one installed already. Yeah, that's part of the container. So I don't know which one it's. If it's automatically giving me my vendor bin folder, or if it's using the containers. Not sure on that.
Looked like it was using the containers because you got a permission denied.
The permission denied is from a Drush alias file that I have in there. Yeah. Nothing to see there. Yeah, some magic. Yeah. So that's an exec. If we wanted to jump inside of there and use DDEV SSH, now you can see I'm sitting at a prompt for the site. You know, I can use Drush status, all of that. You know, if I wanted to run Composer inside. So one use case for this is if you locally on my laptop, I'm running PHP 7.1. But if you were still using, you know, 5.6 locally, and your project is using 7 something, and you need to run Composer install, it's going to have a hard time. I mean, you can force it eventually locally to run nicely, even though the version is wrong, but you can jump inside of your project and run Composer install, and it's going to download the correct version of all those packages then for that version of PHP for your project. So that's a great use for a tool like this in there. Okay, so this is the bit of beyond. To customize this, so DDEV, out of the box, you get just what you need to run a Drupal site at a normal level. You get a web server, database, and it's going to run PHP for you. But you want Solr. Their images don't have, you know, Solr baked in, so we can add to that. So let's move forward. So this goes back to its Docker Compose. So we can provide little stubs of these Docker Compose file, which is 4 lines. Really simple. I'm going to add a Solr to my project. In my settings file, I actually have, I'm cheating a little bit, I have all the connection details already set up so that Search API Solr can talk to it. Some of these things do take a bit of research. You need to find out if the image you're wanting to reference in the Docker Compose file, the other Docker Compose file, what specifics it has. Is it already setting, in the case of Solr, is it setting up the core for you? What credentials do you need to connect? What port is on? All those things. That's going to depend on where you're using images from. This is an Amazy.io project, so I know I already have a core installed. I already know all the credentials, and I can just tell my settings file to grab all those automatically or use defaults, which most of it will be. So then I can, even though the project is running, I can issue a DDEV start again, and it's going to see that new Solr Docker Compose file, and it's going to start up another container for me in isolation that's running Solr. I also added Redis, but I couldn't get it to connect. So, wait, we still have a session open. So we can then go in and look at our Search API configuration. And we have a Solr server that it's talking to now. So it's really easy to add extra bits along. One thing you could do if you have a decoupled project, you could add a Docker Compose file for a node image that you can then tell DDEV is there, and it will talk to that instead of directly to Drupal. So you can test all of those pieces of your project in line from your local without having to try and split it up locally, run a node server, talk to a Drupal somewhere. Right here, they're all able to talk to each other as part of the same project through DDEV. The other way we could customize DDEV is the config.yaml. So these are now they'll no longer be Docker things, Docker composed things. These are going to be specific things that DDEV is looking for when it's running. So in their file, this gets created automatically as part of the config, and it's filling these in based on the answers to the queries as you set things up. So it knew that I wanted PHP 7.1, but we can override those things. We can, if you're really brave, you could use a completely different Nginx image if you wanted, not suggested, because DDEV does expect things to be in certain places and stuff like that, but when you're adding to it, it's not so hard. You're working on a Drupal a domain access site. You can actually specify more host names in an array. So if you need to test your domain access rules and things like that, you can specify that. You run DDEV start again, and it adds all of those to the ways that you can access this project. If you're a fan of Xdebug, of course you can enable that. And then you're kind of back to being able to run different versions of things at the same time. If you're stuck on 5.6 locally for some reason, you need to debug a Drupal 8 project that kind of ran, you can enable that and connect. PHP Storm connects really easy to this, so it'll listen very well. As soon as you hit that breakpoint, it'll pick it up. Generally, you don't have to do any changes to make it work with Xdebug. Oh, this is a good one. So the DB database import command that DDEV gives you, if you want to do things that more closely emulate how you would, like say, deploy your site, you push it out and it's running Drush commands, or you need to change a configuration setting using Drush that you're not allowed to set in that settings file for some reason, you can add all sorts of hooks onto it for running after that as well. So it's very flexible, very powerful. Please use Docker locally. I haven't run Apache in my Mac in about 18 months now. And I work on Node.js, Ruby, PHP projects of varying frameworks, all kinds of stuff every single day. So it's the way we're headed. Tools like DDEV really give us flexibility and make it easier to do these things instead of trying to manage it all by yourself, because it's a lot to know as well. Make sure you have set up the correct way. Yes?
Can you speak a little bit towards the difference between putting everything in a Docker file versus using Docker Compose, or when you would want to use Docker Compose as opposed to just having everything in one long Docker file?
So this kind of gets to the beyond that I was hoping to go to further is you can use both. So one of the nice things about the Docker Hub, where you can go and pick all your images from, is most everyone lets you see the Docker file, which is what describes how one of these images gets built. So you can take that and either copy it wholly and build your own image locally using that, or add your own set of things that then get added to theirs as well using a Docker file. So they're not exclusive at all. In fact,
Docker file, though, is the configuration file.
Docker file,
The image itself.
yes,
Okay.
yeah.
Not the.
Yeah, so you use them in conjunction a lot. DDEV, because of the way it works a bit, you don't want to do tons of that. It's kind of, they're giving you a very predictable base to run on top of, is what it's doing. When you start getting into really customized environments where you're going to need to build from a Docker file, you can still tell Docker Compose to build that on the fly, but a tool like DDEV is starting to become the wrong tool for running those locally. So part of their philosophy is keeping that very stable base, and that's why they don't let you change some of the things in there is because they actually have every bit of code that runs for DDEV is unit tested extensively, like everything. And so they can't have a bunch of customizations that you can provide without and be able to keep that very stable base.
Yeah.
So if you just need PHP database, it's perfect. Start building other things. Your skill set is probably beyond what it needs already. Yeah. So, Sean.
So, if you were going to do, say, a multi-site, you were doing support on a Drupal 7 multi-site or even Drupal 6 multi-site, how would you go about doing that?
That will be very tricky with DDEV specifically because it's only providing one database. You could try and, assuming it's multiple databases and not prefixes. If it's prefixes, then import the database and it'll be perfectly fine. You just add your host names and away it goes. If it's multiple databases, multi-site, then it'd be really hard.
Do you get access to control what the root, username and variable are with the database image?
It would be in the Docker file.
Okay.
But I don't know how it would react.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are we going to use BLT commands inside Docker?
I have no experience with BLT. Zero. So I can't say if it would. I don't know if the tooling is installed for that. If you're on, are you on the Drupal Slack? Get on there, and there's a DDEV channel, and all of their developers are hanging out in there, and they would know the best. Yeah. So, other questions?
How would you define development dependencies or development services like bulk or extending services that aren't like Solar, that are required for production?
If it's something that, it kind of has to be something that's a separate service, and that goes back to their philosophy of it being that stable base. That you can open an issue on the GitHub repo asking for things like that to be added, but they don't. Like if you put something else in their Docker Compose file, it resets it. So that's there's an issue with that, and the line is we own config.yaml and Docker Compose. Done. So it's really tricky to add extra things like that on your own to DDEV. Yeah. Yes.
I just want to make sure I understand. Your Drupal site basically is actually in the file system of your host machine.
Yes.
So services like Gulp would probably be would most of the time be running if you're using it to do pre-processing of CSS.
Depending on your development workflow, yes. So for the sites that I work on that have that, I use just straight Docker Compose, and then I go in and run those inside the container. So it would the simplest way there is to have it running as a separate service, another Docker Compose YAML file, to add the right version of Node so that you can go and run those commands there. Yeah. But if the version you're running locally is compatible with your development and production environments, then have at it. That'll work just fine. Yeah.
Is there an easy way to configure your PHP beyond just your any file, but the whole? I need this extent. I need the LDAP.
They have some details in their docs about extending it. Most of it is centered around the PHP INI file. Support for adding extra PHP modules is not big. Back to that stable base, really. Yeah,
So
yeah,
that's where
yeah. They're trying to build this to be as useful for the largest audience as possible. Is what it is.
What
Yeah.
kind of, off the top of your head, how complete is that? Drupal? Is the PHP module?
Oh, It has pretty much, I mean, anything fairly common. It has, it meets all the dependencies that Drupal needs for sure. But that's basically what it's built around.
But it may not be Memcache.
No. Well, the PHP 7 images are using the op cache, which, I mean, that's why I did one where I added Redis. But for local development, it's generally not a big enough of an issue there. Yeah, for most people, I should say.
You don't have to have LDAP because that's.
I doubt it.
Yeah, that's-
Highly doubt it.
We're
Wait.
really dependent. Yeah, I'm just curious because we're really dependent on that. So,
LDAP.
nice.
Oh wait, that's just protocol. LDAP. Yeah, it's there.
Well, this makes
So you would just enable it in there, the PHP INI. Then yeah,
sense.
yeah.
So it's a pretty complete PHP setup.
Yeah, works really well, and they're responsive to support too. I kind of broke it yesterday. Yeah. So, any other questions? Docker in general? No.
I got some Docker questions. Like, okay, so if you have
Yeah.
a project that you want to allow others to run locally,
Mhm.
not necessarily because they are core contributors to that project, but maybe they might run it locally, is there any need to maintain an image for that project in and of itself?
Just distribute a Docker file.
Images?
You can kind of share images back and forth, but the easier way is to share the Docker file and then build it from that point.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, or
The-
set up a private account, a
Yeah.
paid account on Docker Hub, so you can have the private images.
Yeah.
Also.
And the value of having an image is just the ability for other projects to utilize it. Is that right?
Other projects, and it's generally faster to download an image than it is to build it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hmm.
I test that. I'm building a few images right now.
Right now, yeah,
Forever.
yeah. Thanks.